I was work I was working at a train station in Germany when an American woman walked up to my counter and said, "I need to speak to your manager. Right now." I asked what the problem was. She pointed at the departure board and said, "Your trains are all wrong. They're leaving at impossible times." I looked at the board. Everything seemed normal. I asked her to show me which train she meant. She pointed to one that said 14:30. She said, "See? 14:30. That's not a real time. Your system is broken." I realized what was happening. She didn't understand 24-hour time. I explained that 14:30 meant 2:30 in the afternoon. She stared at me like I'd just made that up. She said, "That's the dumbest system I've ever heard. Why can't you just use regular numbers?" I said, "This is regular for us." She rolled her eyes and said, "Well, it shouldn't be." But that's not even the most confident example I've seen. My friend worked at a pharmacy in the Netherlands, and an American tourist came in demanding Tylenol. My friend offered paracetamol, which is the same thing. The tourist said, "No, I need Tylenol, the American brand." My friend explained that paracetamol is the exact same medication, just a different name. The tourist refused to believe her. He said, "I only trust American medicine. European stuff probably doesn't work the same." My friend pulled up the chemical composition on her computer and showed him they were identical. He squinted at the screen and said, "I still don't trust it." He left without buying anything. Another time, I was at a cafe in Copenhagen when an American couple sat down and immediately started complaining about the lack of free water. The waiter explained that water costs money in most European restaurants. The man said, "That's ridiculous. Water should be free everywhere. It's a basic human right." The waiter nodded politely and said, "You can have tap water for free if you ask." The man said, "I want bottled water for free, like in America." The waiter said, "That's not how it works here." The man leaned back in his chair and said, "Well, it should be." And then there's the story my cousin told me about working at a hotel in Vienna. An American guest called the front desk at 11 at night, furious because the shops were all closed. He said, "What kind of city closes everything at 6 p.m.? Don't they know people need to buy things?" My cousin explained that Austria has strict shop closing laws to protect workers. The guest said, "That's insane. In America, stores are open whenever we want them to be." My cousin said, "Yes, but this is Austria." The guest said, "You should change your laws." Then he hung up. These stories all share the same theme. Americans abroad who genuinely believe that if something works differently than it does back home, it must be wrong. The metric system is wrong. 24-hour time is wrong. Paying for water is wrong. Shops closing early is wrong. And instead of adapting, they demand that entire countries change their systems. So buckle up, because we're diving into the wildest, most face-palm-worthy moments of Americans assuming the rules don't apply abroad. I worked at a car rental agency in France for 3 years. One summer, an American tourist came in to pick up his reservation. I handed him the keys and started explaining the vehicle. He interrupted me and said, "Wait, why does the speedometer go up to 200? That's way too fast." I explained that it was in kilometers per hour, not miles. He looked confused and said, "So, what's the actual speed limit?" I said, "Usually 130 on highways." He did some quick math in his head and said, "That's only like 80 miles per hour. Why does the speedometer go so high?" I said, "In case you need to see higher speeds." He shook his head and said, "This is so unnecessarily complicated. You should just switch to miles." Another time, a woman rented a car and came back 30 minutes later. Absolutely panicked. She said the gas tank was broken because it wouldn't accept her credit card at the pump. I asked if she'd tried paying inside. She said, "No, because the prices are insane. It says $1.80 per liter. That's like $8 a gallon." I explained that yes, gas is more expensive in Europe. She said, "That should be illegal. How does anyone afford to drive here?" I said, "We manage." She said, Well, I'm writing a complaint letter to someone. I didn't ask who. I also remember a guest at a hotel in Switzerland who called down to the desk, furious because the elevator was broken. The receptionist asked what was wrong. The guest said, "I pressed the button for the second floor, and it took me to the third floor." The receptionist realized immediately what happened. In Europe, the ground floor is 0, so the first floor is actually 1 level up. The guest had pressed 2, which took him to the third floor by American standards. The receptionist explained this. The guest said, "That's the most confusing system I've ever heard. Why wouldn't you start counting at 1? The receptionist said, "Because the ground floor is the ground floor." The guest said, "You're all making this harder than it needs to be." Then there was the American woman in Prague who tried to write a check at a grocery store. The cashier politely explained they don't accept checks. The woman said, "What do you mean? Everyone takes checks." The cashier said, "Not in Europe. We use cards or cash." The woman got upset and said, "This is ridiculous. Checks are perfectly valid payment." The cashier said, "Not here." The woman huffed and said, "Well, they should be." She ended up paying with a card, but complained to 3 other customers in line about how backward the system was. My roommate worked at a post office in Belgium, and she told me about an American who wanted to mail a package back to the US. He asked how much it would cost. She told him the price in euros. He said, "Can you just charge me in dollars?" She said, "No, we use euros here." He said, "But I'm American. Can't you make an exception?" She said, "That's not how currency works." He sighed and said, "Europe is so inconvenient." There was also the time I witnessed a tourist in Italy get into an argument with a pharmacist about medicine dosages. The pharmacist recommended a medication in milligrams. The tourist said, "I need it in ounces." The pharmacist said, "We don't measure medicine in ounces." The tourist said, "Why not?" The pharmacist said, "Because we use the metric system." The tourist said, "That doesn't make sense for medicine." The pharmacist just stared at him and said, "It makes perfect sense. It's more precise." The tourist left without buying anything, muttering about how Europe made everything too complicated. Another friend of mine managed a clothing store in Dublin. An American customer tried on a pair of jeans and asked what size they were. My friend said, "Size 32 European." The customer said, "What's that in American sizes?" My friend checked the tag and said, "Probably around a size 10. The customer said, "Why don't you just use American sizes?" My friend said, "Because we're in Ireland." The customer said, "Yeah, but everyone knows American sizes. You'd sell more if you switched." My friend smiled politely and said, "We're doing fine." I also heard about a traveler in Spain who got mad at a restaurant for not having ranch dressing. He asked the waiter why they didn't carry it. The waiter said, "It's not common here." The traveler said, "But it's the most popular dressing in America." The waiter said, "This is Spain." The traveler said, "You'd get more American customers if you had ranch." The waiter said, "We have plenty of customers." Traveler spent the rest of his meal complaining to his wife about how limited the menu was. Then there was the guy in Portugal who tried to tip 20% at a cafe and got confused when the barista seemed uncomfortable. The barista explained that tipping isn't expected in Portugal. The guy said, "But I want to tip. You earned it." The barista said, "Thank you, but it's not necessary." The guy insisted and left the money anyway. Then he told everyone back home that Europeans don't appreciate good service. He completely missed the point. One of my favorite stories came from a hostel in Norway. An American guest kept adjusting the thermostat in the common room, making it warmer and warmer. Other guests kept turning it back down. Finally, someone asked him to stop. He said, "It's freezing in here." The temperature was 27 degrees, which is about 72 degrees. Someone explained that's actually quite warm by Norwegian standards. He said, "You people are crazy. This is way too cold." He wore a winter coat indoors for his entire stay. I worked at a tour company in Barcelona, and we had an American tourist who kept asking why we didn't start tours earlier. Our first tour was at 10 a.m. He wanted one at 7 a.m. I explained that most places don't open until 9 or 10 because Spain has a different schedule. He said, "That's lazy. In America, we start early and work hard." I said, "We work just as hard. We just have different hours." He said, "You'd make more money if you changed." I said, "We're fully booked every day." He didn't have a response to that. Another time, an American woman got upset because shops in Italy closed for lunch. She went to a store at 1 p.m. and found it locked. She waited outside for 20 minutes, getting angrier. When the owner returned at 3:30 p.m., she said, "You can't just close in the middle of the day. That's bad business." The owner said, "This is normal here. Everyone does it." The woman said, "Well, it's inconvenient for tourists." The owner shrugged and said, "We're not open just for tourists." The woman left in a huff and posted a 1-star review online. My friend managed a museum in Amsterdam, and she told me about an American visitor who tried to bring a large backpack inside. Security told him he needed to check it. He refused and said, "I'm not checking my bag. What if something gets stolen?" Security explained it was policy for everyone. He said, "Do you know who I am?" Security said, "No, sir." He said, "I'm an American citizen. I have rights." Security said, "Not in this museum. You don't." He eventually checked the bag, but complained to staff the entire visit. There was also the couple in Greece who got mad because their hotel room didn't have a coffee maker. They called the front desk and demanded one. The receptionist explained that European hotels typically don't have in-room coffee makers. The wife said, "That's unacceptable. We need coffee in the morning." The receptionist offered to bring them coffee from the breakfast area. The husband said, "We shouldn't have to wait. We should be able to make it ourselves." The receptionist said, "I can bring you instant coffee and a kettle." They said, "Instant coffee? Absolutely not." They checked out a day early. I heard about a traveler in Germany who got upset at a restaurant because they wouldn't split the check. In Germany, it's common to pay together or figure it out yourself. The traveler insisted the server calculate individual amounts. The server said, "We don't usually do that here." The traveler said, "In America, servers always split checks." The server said, "This isn't America." The traveler said, "Customer service here is terrible." The server just walked away. Another story came from a friend who worked at a beach in Croatia. An American tourist set up a huge beach tent, speakers, and a cooler, basically creating a private party zone. A local politely asked him to turn down the music. The tourist said, "I'm on vacation. I can do what I want." The local said, "This is a public beach. You need to be considerate." The tourist said, "I paid good money to come here." The local said, "So did everyone else." Eventually, the police came and made him pack up. He spent the rest of the day complaining about how unfriendly Croatians were. I also remember an American woman in France who got into an argument with a bakery owner. She wanted a custom cake made in 2 hours. The owner said it wasn't possible. She said, "Why not? You're a bakery." He said, "I need at least 24 hours for custom orders." She said, "In America, bakeries can do it same day." He said, "Then go to America." She left and posted online about how rude French people are. The comments section did not side with her. Then there was the guy in Sweden who kept trying to make small talk with strangers on the train. People politely ignored him. He got offended and later told people that Swedes are cold and unfriendly. Someone explained that Swedes value personal space and quiet on public transport. He said, "That's antisocial." The person said, "That's culture." He said, "It's a bad culture." The conversation ended there. My cousin worked at a restaurant in Brussels, and an American couple came in at 10 p.m. demanding dinner. The kitchen had closed at 9:30. The waiter apologized and said they could only offer drinks and desserts. The man said, "What kind of restaurant closes the kitchen at 9:30?" The waiter said, "Most restaurants here." The man said, "That's absurd. We're hungry." The waiter suggested a late-night cafe down the street. The man said, "We shouldn't have to go somewhere else. You should stay open later." The waiter said, "We open at breakfast." The couple left and gave the restaurant a 1-star review for terrible hours. There was also the traveler in Poland who got upset because no one spoke English at a small local restaurant. He kept saying, "Does anyone here speak English?" Louder and louder. Finally, an older woman said in broken English, "This is Poland. We speak Polish." He said, "But I'm a tourist. You should have English menus," she said. "We are local restaurant." He said, "You're losing business." She said, "We are full every night." He left and ate at McDonald's. I'll never forget the American woman in Austria who tried to haggle at a grocery store. She picked up a bottle of wine, brought it to the register, and said, "I'll give you 10 euros for this." The cashier said, "It's 14 euros. The woman said, "I'll pay 10. The cashier said, "This isn't a market. Prices are fixed." The woman said, "Everything's negotiable." The cashier said, "Not here." The woman huffed and said, "Fine," and paid full price. Then she told her travel group that Austrian stores are a rip-off. I was working at a train station in the Netherlands when an American traveler tried to board without a ticket. I stopped him and said he needed to buy one first. He said, "I'll buy it on the train." I explained that doesn't work here. You need a ticket before boarding or you get a fine. He said, "That's a scam." I said, "That's the rule." He said, "In America, you can buy tickets on the train." I said, "This is the Netherlands." He grumbled and bought a ticket, but spent the next 5 minutes telling me how backward the system was. Another time, my friend worked at a parking garage in Copenhagen. An American driver parked in a no-parking zone and came back to find a ticket on his windshield. He stormed into the office and said, "I'm a tourist. I didn't know." My friend said, "There are signs everywhere." He said, "They're in Danish." My friend said, "They also have pictures." He said, "I shouldn't get a ticket for an honest mistake." My friend said, "Everyone gets tickets for parking illegally." He said, "This is a money grab." He paid the fine but complained the entire time. I also heard about a traveler in Germany who got caught riding public transport without a ticket. The inspector asked for his ticket. The traveler said he didn't have one. The inspector said that's a $60 fine. The traveler said, "I'm not paying that. I didn't know I needed a ticket." The inspector said, "Ignorance isn't an excuse." The traveler said, "I'm American. Cut me some slack." The inspector said, "The fine applies to everyone." The traveler refused to give his information, so the inspector called the police. The traveler ended up paying the fine plus an additional fee. He later posted online about being harassed by German authorities. Then there was the American woman in Switzerland who jaywalked in front of a tram and got yelled at by the driver. She yelled back, "I'm just crossing the street." A pedestrian nearby said, "You have to wait for the light." She said, "The road was clear." The pedestrian said, "It's still illegal." She said, "That's a stupid law." The pedestrian said, "It keeps people safe." She said, "I can look both ways." The pedestrian gave up and walked away. She jaywalked 3 more times that day. My roommate worked at a campground in Norway, and an American family showed up without a reservation. She told them they were fully booked. The father said, "Can't you just squeeze us in?" She said, "We have no space." He said, "We drove all the way here." She said, "You need to book in advance during summer," he said. "In America, campgrounds always have space." She said, "This isn't America." He said, "You should have more spots." She suggested another campground 20 minutes away. He said, "We shouldn't have to drive more." They eventually left, but the father left a negative review saying the campground had poor customer service. There was also the guy in Italy who got ticketed for drinking beer on the street. He didn't know it was illegal in certain areas. He said to the officer, "I'm just having a beer." The officer explained the local ordinance. The guy said, "That's insane. It's just a drink." The officer said, "It's the law." The guy said, "Do you know how much I paid to come here?" The officer said, "That doesn't matter." The guy paid the fine, but spent the rest of his trip telling people that Italy was a police state. I remember an American tourist in Spain who got into trouble for taking photos inside a cathedral. A staff member asked him to stop. He said, "Why? I'm not hurting anything." The staff member said, "Photography isn't allowed inside." He said, "I didn't see a sign." The staff member pointed to 3 different signs. He said, "They're in Spanish." The staff member said, "And English and French." He looked closer and said, "Oh." Then he said, "Well, I already took the photos." The staff member asked him to delete them. He refused. Security escorted him out. Another friend told me about working at a national park in Iceland. An American couple ignored the marked trails and walked directly on protected moss fields. A ranger approached them and explained the moss takes decades to grow and is protected by law. The woman said, "We're just taking a photo." The ranger said, "You need to stay on the path." The man said, "We're barely touching it." The ranger said, "You're standing on it." The man said, "It's just moss." The ranger issued them a fine. They argued for 20 minutes but eventually paid it. They later posted online about how Iceland was too strict. I also heard about a traveler in Austria who lit a cigarette inside a train station. An officer immediately told him to put it out. The traveler said, "I'm outside." The officer said, "Not outside enough. This is still station property." The traveler said, "That's ridiculous." The officer said, "It's the rule." The traveler said, "I've been traveling for 3 weeks and I'm tired of all these rules." The officer said, "Then follow them and you won't have problems." The traveler put out the cigarette but muttered complaints the entire time. Then there was the American guy in France who parked his rental car in a disabled spot without a permit. He came back to find a massive fine. He went to the police station and said, "I was only there for 10 minutes. The officer said, "It's still illegal." He said, "The lot was full." The officer said, "That doesn't matter." He said, "The fine is way too high." The officer said, "It's meant to be a deterrent." He said, "This is unfair." The officer said, "You parked illegally." He paid the fine, but told everyone he knew that France was a bureaucratic nightmare. I think the story that best captures this whole dynamic happened to me in Berlin. I was riding the U-Bahn when an American tourist got on without validating his ticket. In Berlin, you're supposed to validate your ticket before boarding, but it's an honor system. Most of the time, no one checks. But every so often, plainclothes inspectors get on and check everyone. That day, inspectors got on. They went through the car asking everyone for tickets. The American handed his over. The inspector said, "This isn't validated." The American said, "What does that mean?" The inspector explained that he needed to stamp it before boarding. The American said, "No one told me that." The inspector said, "It's written on the ticket." The American looked at it and said, "That's in German," the inspector said, "and English." The American looked again and went quiet. The inspector issued him a fine. The American said, "This is ridiculous. I bought a ticket." The inspector said, "But you didn't validate it." The American said, "That's a technicality." The inspector said, "That's the system." The American said, "I'm not paying this." The inspector said, "Then the police will be involved." The American realized he wasn't going to win. He paid the fine. As the inspectors moved on, he turned to the person next to him and said, "Can you believe this?" The person, a local, said, "Yes, "You didn't follow the rules." The American said, "The rules are stupid." The local said, "They're the rules." The American got off at the next stop. That interaction sums it all up. Americans abroad who assume that because something seems inconvenient or unfamiliar, it must be wrong. And instead of adapting or asking questions, they push back. They argue, they complain, they demand exceptions, and when the answer is still no, they walk away convinced that the entire country is the problem, not their refusal to follow basic local customs. These stories happen every single day. Someone parks illegally and gets mad about the fine. Someone rides public transport without a ticket and argues with the inspector. Someone ignores a no-smoking sign and gets upset when told to stop. The pattern never changes. The expectation is always the same. The rules shouldn't apply to me because I'm a tourist. I didn't know. I'm American. Cut me some slack, but here's the thing. The rules do apply. Every country has systems, laws, and cultural expectations. And when you visit, you're expected to follow them. Not because anyone's trying to inconvenience you, but because that's how societies function. And if you can't accept that, you're going to have a really frustrating time abroad. So if you're planning to travel, do yourself a favor. Learn the basics before you go. Understand that things work differently. Accept that you're the visitor, not the other way around. Because if you don't, you'll end up as one of these stories. And trust me, these stories